Hello and welcome back to the channel. We're going to continue the talk about the soul. When we look at movies like Blade Runner, can we imagine that these robots, or replicants as they're called, can they or do they have a soul, and is that something that we can expect in our world?
I mean, it's a big question, and it's an extension of the question of the degree to which human beings can be copied and whether those copies can be mistaken for a human being or not. And in films like Blade Runner, that's in a sense the whole premise. Can you tell the robot apart from the human?
You think I'm a replicant, don't you?
And it asks those questions, and asks what is the fundamental difference between a human and a robot. And people often say, well, the main difference is that humans feel things and robots don't feel things. You can give an AI the language of emotion so that it can attest to feelings, and it can change its tone of voice if it's a voice robot. So it can kind of simulate emotion.
Oh, hate, love, fear, anger, envy.
But you're asking a question about the soul, which I think, in my view at least, is a different question than the question of emotion. There's another famous film about robots called Her, where a man falls in love with a robot, but just a voice. And it plays on his emotions, says all the right things to draw him in, engage him, and make him like her and fall in love with her and become dependent.
I've never loved anyone the way I love you.
And I think that's, not implausible, because after all, a relationship is a relationship. And if a robot's capable of playing their side of the bargain and stimulating in turn relational feelings on the part of, in this case, the man, then he is in a relationship with that entity.
Don't you love me?
But again, only at an emotional level. You're asking a question about the soul, and I make a distinction between the soul and the level of the emotions. And I think this might be an unpopular view, but I don't think, for example, that the soul is about having, peaceful, easy feelings, to quote the Eagles song. Or, as Freud said, he had this word of oceanic feeling. Is spirituality about an oceanic feeling, a sense of wonder or awe, when we gaze up at the stars, that the feelings that we have there are often thought of as spiritual feelings and perhaps soulful feelings. I mean, I'd also make a distinction between spirit and soul, but the main point here is that I don't think there's such a thing as soul emotions.
And what's the difference between the spirit and the soul?
Well, this is all up for debate. My definition is just my definition, and different people define it in different ways. So one way of understanding it is that the origin of the word soul is very different from the origin of the word spirit. So the word soul in English comes from a, sort of early medieval word, Seele, which is actually where we get the word silly in modern day English. To be silly is to be a person of the soul, of something insubstantial. What silly is insubstantial. That's soul. Spirit is related to a completely different set of things, but all to do with the breath, like inspiration, respiration. The spirit, and I think of the spirit as being almost like the essence of somebody. Like, what's your spirit? Well, we know you have, for example, quite a positive spirit or quite a negative spirit. You might talk about people, the kind of atmosphere they create around them. When somebody comes into the room, you know what their spirit is like, because it's almost like an emanation of their mood. That's their general spirit. And of course, their spirits can go up and down. Their humours can be good or bad. But generally speaking, I think of the spirit as being a bit like your entity. And when we think about the spirit world, what you're getting at there almost is the character of the person who's passed away, the spirit of a dead person. That's all spirit, in my view. Soul, I think, is much more difficult to get hold of because it's not about the quality of a person, the character, the essence of a person, nor, as I was trying to say, is it about feelings. I think you can have, spiritual feelings of wonder and awe gazing at the stars. That's fine. But for me, the soul is about something much more intangible to do with the gradual awakening of consciousness over time. So your soul, to put it very crudely, is more or less awakened, more or less enlightened. So if you think about enlightenment in the religious sense, say in Buddhism, for example, one might talk about the pursuit of enlightenment and enlightened beings versus non-enlightened beings. For me, that would be a way of understanding the soul. How enlightened is this person? In other words, how expanded is their consciousness? Or to put it in slightly more religious terms, how open is that person to the presence of the divine? And how kind of manifest is the divine within them in some way? That for me is not a question of emotions, how you feel about something, or even being wonderstruck at the heavens, all of which are completely valid feelings. I've got nothing against them, but I don't think they're to do with the soul. The soul is this thing about the expanding of consciousness, which I think is potentially limitless, and something that can continue at the level of the soul after the body has died. So the soul can continue to expand and learn through potentially being incarnated in other bodies, but over time. And then eventually, or this is my take on it, and people I'm sure will disagree wildly, the ultimate destiny of the soul is actually to disappear and disappear back into the divine, the cosmos, the divine consciousness, the source, all of these names for the the one, the bigger picture, the God. There are different words for it. But that for me is what the soul is. When you're talking about Blade Runner, we're talking about robots simulating human emotion.
Seeing things you people wouldn't believe.
And by simulating human emotion, like pity, love, mercy, humour, they stimulate corresponding emotions in the other person.
Glitter in the dark near the 10-house gate.
That's fine. That's a pseudo-human replicated version of emotion. The proviso being that, in a way, all of our emotion is learned and replicated. When we were growing up as babies, if you think of young children, how they learn to be emotionally articulate human beings is by copying. It's the same way they learn language. So when they express sorrow or anger, we think it's authentic, and it probably is, but it's learned through mimicry, just as a robot learns. So the more philosophical question there is, can you really tell the difference between mimicry, imitated emotion, and the real thing?
Testing whether I'm a replicant.
Yeah, because there's a lot of people who get
Trolled?
not trolled, catfished.
Right, because they're imitating
Yeah.
feelings. Yeah.
So that's kind of weird because the person on the other side is an actual person, but they are they're kind of removing themselves and this,
Yeah, and human beings are capable themselves of falsity. Lying is an obvious example. I can say one thing but feel another. If you go round for dinner with some friends and they serve some food which you don't like, you might well say, oh, this is delicious. Or you get a birthday present and you say, oh yes, I've always wanted this. It's a lie. We're capable of mimicry, and saying things which aren't true. This is just a fact about human beings. Robots are in a sense just an extension of that fact that we're capable of imitation. And if you think of actual acting on a stage, or you talked about films right at the beginning, you know, Harrison Ford is acting in that film. He's not being authentically him.
I was being so charming.
We're all capable of playing roles all of the time outside of films and the stage. So I don't think we need to be too purist about this idea of what the true human is, because we're already creatures of mimicry and lies and deception. You know, people tell lies the whole time, white lies as well as, you know, more sinister lies. So to insist upon a kind of radical distinction between the robot and the human, I think is a misnomer. You know, there are robotic elements to human beings already, insofar as we can simulate emotion already.
Yeah.
You know, so in a way, robots are simulating humans simulating.
And it also, can't narcissists, like, don't they copy other people's emotions and just simulate them and play it back? Or is that psychopaths or sociopaths?
I mean, sociopaths and psychopaths and narcissists seem to be, you know, hot property on the internet, don't they? Well, yeah, I mean, the simulation of an emotion is something we all do as a way of learning it when we're young. But the question with the psychopath is the intent behind it. You know, are we simulating mercy, pity, love, warmth, sympathy for an ulterior motive, which is to our advantage and the other person's disadvantage? You know, so the psychopathy lies in the intent, not the practice. Because if you say something, you tell me you've had a hard day, and I go, oh, you know, how awful, I might not really feel it, but at least I'm, you know, expressing sympathy. And as far as you're concerned, that might be enough. Now, as long as my intent isn't then also to manipulate in some way, I stop short of being a psychopath. But my emotion might be not that, you know, purely authentic, because at the back of my mind, I might be thinking, oh, you know, poor her, she's had a hard day, but, you know, I'm worried when the football starts, you know. So there's I think the intent behind the mimicry is perhaps as important as anything else.
So psychopaths have souls?
Well, we don't know that anybody has a soul, but if human beings have souls, then, and if
It's to what degree they have
and if
a soul.
psychopaths are human, then it follows psychopaths have souls. But I mean, that raises a much more profound question, which is, can an evil person have a soul? And if you think about Milton's Paradise Lost, for example, the figure of Satan and Lucifer, you know, these were angels.
Yeah.
They weren't, actually, they were above human beings, but arguably, I mean, they would have had souls, I suppose.
Yeah.
You know, so a soul is neither in itself good or bad necessarily, perhaps, but, you know, it has this, it's the capacity to expand consciousness. I mean, you could also argue that, you know, whatever God is, whatever the divine is capable of both good and bad. This is the perennial question, isn't it, about God? If there's a God in the world, how can you have the Holocaust? You know, how can you reconcile these two things? So yeah, a psychopath, if human, might have a soul. Are souls in and of themselves good or bad? I don't know. But intentions can be bad. I think, you know, what's psychopathic about the psychopath, insofar as I understand psychopathy, is the intention, you know, and the capacity to mimic friendly behavior, even though the intent is hostile. Thanks very much for watching this video. It's very much appreciated. If you do like it, please give it a thumbs up and also subscribe to the channel. Thank you.